Okay, bear with me here as I'm not the greatest in front of the camera, but first up we have the ankle joint or the talar girdle joint. This is a type of hinge joint, and the movements are dorsiflexion, which is up, and then plantar flexion, which is down, and then the range of motion takes place in the sagittal plane with a frontal axis of motion, and then there is 1 degree of freedom for this joint, so up and down. Okay, next up we have the knee joint, which is the tibiofemoral joint. This is another hinge joint like the ankle joint before. The range of motion is, so from here, you have flexion and then extension. And then the range of motion takes place in the sagittal plane, and then it has a frontal axis of motion. And then because it's a hinge joint like the ankle joint, this has 1 degree of freedom. Okay, now we have the hip joint, or the, bear with me here, acetabular joint. We have, for movements, this is a ball and socket joint. That's the type of joint it is. But for movements, we have flexion here, a leg's coming up, extension, it goes back. We have abduction, leg going away. I don't know, can't really see me super well, but going away, and then adduction, it comes back in. Then we have external rotation with the, so you think the knee goes out, foot's in, then an internal rotation, the knee's in, the foot's out. There's different planes here for these movements. So for flexion and extension, that's the sagittal plane. And then for the abduction and adduction, that would be the frontal plane, and then the transverse plane would be my rotations. Then there's 3 different axes of motion as well. So we have, for the sagittal plane, that'd be the frontal axis of motion, and then the sagittal axis of motion would be for the frontal plane, and then for the transverse plane, it would be the vertical axis of motion. And there is 3 degrees of freedom for this particular joint. Okay, next we have the shoulder joint, or the glenohumeral joint. So we have flexion, extension here, as the arm's going forward and backwards, and then we have abduction, and then adduction, and then we have the internal rotation and the external rotation of the shoulder. And then there's different planes here for these, for this joint. So for the flexion and extension, that would be the sagittal plane. For the abduction and adduction, I'm saying that very fast, it would be the frontal plane. And then for the rotations, that would be the transverse plane, sorry. And then there's different axes of motion as well. So for the for the sagittal plane, the axis of motion would be the frontal axis of motion, and then for the frontal plane, it would be the sagittal axis of motion, and then it would be the vertical axis of motion for the transverse plane. And then this is another ball and socket joint, so we have 3 degrees of freedom. All right, now on to the elbow joint, which is the humerulnar joint. Movements are flexion, here I'll go this way, flexion and extension, and this takes place in the sagittal plane with a frontal axis of motion. And then this is a hinge joint. I didn't clarify that earlier, but it is a hinge joint, which means there is 1 degree of freedom. Okay, now for the wrist joint, or the radiocarpal joint, we have, this is an ellipsoid joint, and as you can see here, we have flexion and extension. Then we also have radial deviation and ulnar deviation. And for these planes, we have for the flexion and extension, it'd be in the sagittal plane, and then for the deviations that would be in the frontal plane, and which would mean that for the axis of motion, frontal axis of motion would be for the sagittal, and then sagittal axis of motion would be for the frontal plane. And then because this is an ellipsoid joint, it has 2 degrees of freedom. Okay, and lastly we have the cervical spine joint, or the atlanto-occipital joint is a proper name. The type of joint, this is a condyloid joint. So we have my cervical spine, so we have flexion down and extension up. Okay, I'll do there. Then we have my lateral flexion, turn around. Okay, so then for my flexion and extension, so mine down, up, we have, that takes place in the sagittal plane, and it has a frontal axis of motion. Then for my lateral flexions, that takes place in the frontal plane with a sagittal axis of motion. Like I said, this is a condyloid joint, so this has 2 degrees of freedom.